The river ran dark and sluggish beneath the grey sky, swollen with the recent autumn rains. Its surface shimmered under the pale light of dawn, whispering secrets only the current understood. Along its banks, tall reeds swayed in the cold wind, hiding something nestled deep within them, a bundle, barely stirring, barely alive. The baby had been left there in the night. Wrapped in a thin cloth, she lay on a bed of damp grass, her tiny fists curled against her chest. She did not cry anymore, she had, for hours, until exhaustion stole her voice. If no one came soon, the riverbank would become her grave. But someone did come. Old Thomas, the fisherman, walked the same path he did every morning, his net slung over his shoulder, his joints stiff from age and hard labor. He had lived by this river for nearly 60 years, had seen it rise and fall, take lives and spare them. But never had he seen what he saw that morning. At first, he thought it was just another piece of cloth discarded by travelers. But then, the bundle moved. A faint whimper rose above the rustling reeds. Thomas froze. Then, he moved forward and knelt, hands shaking as he pulled back the damp fabric. His breath caught in his throat. A child. A girl, no older than a few days. Her skin was pale, too pale. Her lips tinged blue from the cold. Yet her eyes, when they opened, were dark and full of something Thomas could not name. Something ancient. Who had left her here? And why? Thomas knew one thing: if he walked away now, she would not live to see another sunrise. With a sigh, he lifted the baby into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, yet she carried a weight in his chest that he could not explain. "Who left you here, little one?" he murmured. The river did not answer. Thomas lived alone in a small wooden cottage on the outskirts of the village. His wife had passed years ago, and their only child had been taken by fever before her 5th birthday. Since then, Thomas had spoken more to the river than to people. But now, he had company. He wrapped the baby in dry blankets, fed her warm milk, and held her close to the fire. Slowly, color returned to her cheeks, and the stiffness in her limbs eased. He named her Maren, after the river that had tried to claim her. The village whispered about the old fisherman and his strange new child. Where had she come from? Who had abandoned her? No answers ever came. But Maren grew. By the time she was 5, she was a quiet, watchful child, always listening, always watching. She never laughed like the other children, nor did she cry. Instead, she would sit by the river for hours, staring at the water as if it was speaking to her. The first sign. The first time Thomas saw it, he thought he was imagining things. It was a hot summer afternoon. Maren had wandered down to the water's edge while Thomas mended his nets. He glanced up just in time to see her reach out a small hand, and the river reach back. The water shifted, moving unnaturally toward her, as if drawn by an invisible force. Thomas dropped his net. "Maren." She turned, startled, and the water fell back into place as if nothing had happened. But Thomas had seen it. He said nothing that night, but he watched her more closely. And then it happened again. And again. By the time she was 10, there was no doubt. The river obeyed her. She never spoke of it, never asked why. It was simply part of her, as natural as breathing. But Thomas knew that power like hers did not come without consequence. And soon, the village would notice. It started with a drought. The river shrank, its banks dry and cracked. The crops withered, the wells ran low, and the people grew desperate. And desperate people needed someone to blame. The whispers began in the marketplace. "She's not natural. She was found by the river, what if she's cursed? The old man should have left her there." Maren heard them all. One evening, she sat by the water, her knees drawn to her chest. Thomas sat beside her, his old bones aching, but his heart aching more. "You hear what they say," she murmured. Thomas sighed. "They fear what they do not understand." "Should I go?" Her voice was small. "No." Thomas placed a hand on hers. "You are my child, Maren. Let them talk. Words can't harm you." He was wrong. Because sometimes, words became fire. The mob came after midnight. Torches in hand, faces twisted with fear and anger. They pounded on Thomas's door. Give her up, old man. She's brought ruin upon us. Thomas barred the door. Go home, he shouted. She's done nothing. A stone shattered the window. Maren stood in the corner, silent, eyes wide. The air around her felt charged, heavy with something unseen. Thomas turned to her, his heart breaking. Maren, you must run. She shook her head. Go, he pleaded. To the river. But before she could move, the door splintered open.
The first man who stepped inside never made it further. The water came for him. It rose not from the river, but from the air itself, from the moisture in the night. A wave crashed through the door, sweeping him and the others back. Maren stood, her small hands clenched. The river had always listened to her whispers. Now, it heard her scream. The water surged through the village, flooding streets, dousing torches, washing away fear and anger in a single, terrible moment. And then, silence. The people fled, drenched and shaken, their rage drowned in the force of something they could not comprehend. Thomas, coughing from the damp, looked at Maren. Tears streamed down her face. I didn't mean to. He pulled her close. I know. But the damage was done. By morning, the village was empty. The people had left, fearing Maren, fearing what she could do. Thomas and Maren stood at the river's edge. They won't come back, she whispered. No, Thomas said. And neither can we. She looked up at him, eyes dark and full of sorrow. Then where do we go? Thomas placed a hand on her shoulder. Where the river takes us. With one last look at the home they had lost, Maren stepped forward. The river swirled around her feet, welcoming her, carrying her forward. Thomas followed. Together, they walked into the current, vanishing into the endless embrace of the water. And the river, which had once tried to claim a dying baby, now carried away a girl who was more than human, who was part of it, always had been. And always would be.